Radar screens light up across 3 time zones simultaneously. At Yokota Air Base in Japan, duty officers move to their stations. At Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii, watch commanders reach for secure communications. At Indopacom headquarters, the overnight shift is suddenly no longer quiet. In the Taiwan Strait, something has changed. The ship movements that began as exercises, scheduled, announced, routine, are no longer routine. The formation geometry is wrong for an exercise. The electronic signatures are wrong. The timing is wrong. In the command centers of the Republic of China Armed Forces, a question is being asked that has been rehearsed for decades, but never operationally answered. Is this it? The Taiwan Strait is 180 kilometers of contested water. It is one of the most militarily scrutinized bodies of water on Earth. Every radar contact is logged, every radio transmission analyzed, every ship movement assessed against a baseline built over decades of continuous observation. And something has changed. This is not a prediction. It is an analysis. An examination of the military systems, command structures, and strategic logic that would shape one of the most consequential scenarios in modern geopolitics, if it ever begins. This is the command structure. Let's break it down. To understand the military dimensions of a potential Taiwan conflict, you first need to understand why the conflict exists, not at the level of rhetoric, but at the level of competing systems and institutional commitments that have been accumulating for 75 years. The Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. The Communist Party of China established the People's Republic of China on the mainland. The nationalist government, the Republic of China, retreated to the island of Taiwan with military forces, government apparatus, and roughly 1.2 million soldiers and civilians. 2 governments now claim to be the legitimate government of all of China. The People's Republic claimed Taiwan as its province, temporarily administered by a renegade government. The Republic of China claimed the mainland as territory temporarily under communist occupation. Both claims remain technically in force, even though the practical interpretation of both has evolved. Our strategic geography created a permanent problem. A heavily armed government on an island 180 kilometers from a hostile state that claims it. Separated by a strait too wide for casual crossing, but not wide enough for comfortable strategic distance. The United States entered this equation immediately and has never fully left it. During the Korean War, President Truman ordered the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait to prevent military action by either side, and that decision effectively placed the United States between the 2 Chinese governments, and in various forms it remains there today. The 1954 and 1958 Taiwan Strait crises brought the United States close to direct confrontation with China. In both cases, U.S. naval positioning was the variable that prevented Chinese escalation. In 1979, the United States shifted formal diplomatic recognition from Taipei to Beijing. But at the same time, SAR Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, a law committing the United States to provide Taiwan with arms sufficient for its defense, and to maintain U.S. capacity to resist any non-peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question. The act is not a mutual defense treaty. It is deliberately constructed to be less than an automatic commitment, while being more than an empty declaration. This is the foundation of what became known as strategic ambiguity. China cannot know for certain what the United States would do in a military conflict. Taiwan cannot know for certain what the United States would do. The United States has maintained this ambiguity as a feature, not a flaw. It raises the costs of Chinese military action by introducing uncertainty, while avoiding the obligation of a formal defense commitment. Strategic ambiguity is not a permanent solution. It is a deferral mechanism. And like all deferral mechanisms, as it depends on underlying conditions remaining stable enough that deferral continues to serve interests on all sides. The question military planners have studied for decades is simple. Well, what happens when deferral no longer works? In the modern period, the underlying conditions have changed, and the rate of change accelerated after roughly 2012. The PLA's modernization program began in earnest after the 1995 to 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis. Since then, it has produced a military categorically different from the force that faced the U.S. 7th Fleet in 1996. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, advanced submarines, a growing carrier fleet, and major command and control reforms represent a qualitative transformation, not just a larger budget. Taiwan has also changed. Polling consistently shows that a strong majority of Taiwan's 23 million people identify as Taiwanese rather than Chinese. Support for formal independence, even if not the official position of government, is significant and persistent. That political identity shift is itself a strategic variable. A population that increasingly sees itself as distinct is harder to reintegrate without coercion. Meanwhile, the regional military balance has shifted. The point at which U.S. forces could intervene with reasonable confidence has been pushed outward, not necessarily reversed, but made more complex by China's anti-access architecture. These trends do not make conflict inevitable. They make it a different problem than it was a generation ago. To understand what a conflict might look like, you have to understand the forces involved, not by slogans, but by structure. The People's Liberation Army is the world's largest active military by personnel. But headcounts are not the point. The question is how the PLA is organized to fight, and how that organization has changed. In 2016, China implemented the most comprehensive military restructuring since the founding of the People's Republic. It replaced the old military region system with 5 theater commands: Eastern, Western, Southern, Northern, and Central. Each theater command is a joint war-fighting command responsible for operations in its geographic area, drawing on forces from all services. For Taiwan, the Eastern Theater Command, headquartered in Nanjing, would be the primary operational authority, and it covers the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the approaches to the first island chain. Above the theater commands sits the Central Military Commission, the CMC, which exercises supreme authority over PLA forces. The CMC is chaired by the General Secretary of the Communist Party, currently Xi Jinping. The implication here is centralization. A Taiwan scenario would be fought under a command structure designed to align military action closely with political authority. But now consider the naval dimension. The PLA Navy has undergone one of the most dramatic expansions of any naval force in the post-Cold War era. By hull count, it became the world's largest navy, surpassing the United States around 2020. Its carrier program illustrates the scale of development. Liaoning entered service in 2012 as a training platform. Shandong followed in 2019 as the first domestically designed carrier. Fujian, launched in 2022, represents a major leap. Built with electromagnetic catapults comparable in concept to U.S. systems. Beyond carriers, the plan has expanded a powerful surface force, including large Type 055 destroyers and Type 052D destroyers. And for a Taiwan scenario, the critical component is amphibious capacity. Type 075 landing helicopter docks, Type 071 transport docks, and a large inventory of landing ships and landing craft. Submarines are the other major variable. China operates roughly 60 submarines, including nuclear ballistic missile submarines, nuclear attack submarines, and advanced conventional boats. In any Taiwan scenario, submarines are central to sea denial and to threatening surface forces that attempt to intervene. In the air, the PLA Air Force operates a large inventory of combat aircraft, including advanced platforms such as the J-20 stealth fighter and the J-16 multi-role fighter. But the most strategically consequential element for Taiwan is the PLA Rocket Force. Separated into an independent service, the Rocket Force operates systems across the full spectrum: short-range missiles that can saturate Taiwan, and longer-range systems designed to hold U.S. forces at risk. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles are the key development here. A weapon launched from mobile platforms on the mainland, capable of reaching moving ships at long range, changes the risk calculus for naval forces operating near China's coast. Now compare that to Taiwan's defense. Taiwan cannot match the PLA symmetrically. Its strategy is asymmetric: to make the cost of invasion high enough to deter, and if deterrence fails, to impose attrition severe enough to prevent success. This approach is often described as the porcupine strategy. The focus is survivable, dispersed, mobile systems rather than large platforms likely to be destroyed on day one. Mobile anti-ship missiles, layered air defense systems, and a dense network of sensors and radar coverage form the core of this defensive system. Taiwan's Air Force fields advanced F-16 Super, plus local fighters and older aircraft, and has invested in hardened shelters, dispersal, and emergency runway concepts. Taiwan's Navy is comparatively small. Its strategic value is not fleet-to-fleet combat, but coastal defense, sea denial, submarines, fast missile craft, and mine warfare. There is also the question of reserves. On paper, Taiwan's reserve manpower is large. In practice, readiness and training have been a persistent concern. Reforms have been launched, but implementation is ongoing. And then there is the third variable that shapes everything: the United States. Any serious analysis that ignores the United States is incomplete. The question is not whether the U.S. would be involved in some capacity. It almost certainly would. The question is how, at what level, when with what timing, under what constraints. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, headquartered in Hawaii, covers more than half the planet. Its forward deployments in Japan, Guam, and the Philippines place significant forces within operational range of the Taiwan Strait. But within range is not the same as able to operate freely. China's anti-access and area denial architecture has been built specifically to complicate U.S. intervention inside the first island chain. Every capability the U.S. would want to use, carriers, surface ships, land-based aircraft, is threatened by layers of missiles, aircraft, submarines, and sensors. This brings us to the system that defines the modern problem. A 2/AD, anti-access and area denial, is a layered capability set designed to prevent an opposing force from entering a region or operating freely inside it. China's A2/AD architecture is among the most comprehensive ever assembled, and the Taiwan Strait sits at its center. It functions in rings, and the innermost ring, out to a few hundred kilometers, is dense with short-range missiles, coastal defenses, and air defense networks. The next ring extends to around 1,500 kilometers. The range associated with systems like the DF-21D, covering the first island chain. The outer ring extends further still, reaching toward Guam, threatening key staging bases for U.S. power projection. The goal of this architecture is not to make intervention impossible. It is to make it expensive, risky, and time-sensitive. Now look at the geography. The Taiwan Strait is 180 kilometers wide at its narrowest point and shallow by naval standards, roughly 60 meters on average. That shallow environment limits some submarine operations in the strait itself. East of Taiwan, in the Philippine Sea, the environment changes dramatically. Deep water, favorable for submarines, and a likely approach axis for U.S. reinforcements. Any Chinese plan to seize Taiwan must address that eastern axis, either by contesting it or by moving fast enough that intervention arrives too late. The strait's geometry also constrains amphibious operations. Taiwan's western coast has a limited number of viable landing areas for heavy forces. Those areas are well known and heavily prepared, which means the opening of overt conflict would almost certainly be dominated by missiles. Taiwan presents a finite target set, a limited number of air bases, radar sites, command centers, logistics nodes, and naval facilities. China has studied these targets for decades. A coordinated strike combining ballistic and cruise missiles could blind sensors, crater runways, disrupt command networks, and degrade Taiwan's ability to generate air power within the first hours. Taiwan's missile defense is designed to blunt this strike, not to stop it completely. No system intercepts 100% of a large coordinated missile campaign. The real defense is a combination of interception, dispersal, hardening, redundancy, and rapid recovery. Before missiles, however, there is a phase that begins earlier and is harder to see. Cyber operations, space assets, electronic warfare. Cyber is not usually decisive alone, but it can degrade Taiwan's civil infrastructure, disrupt mobilization, complicate communications, and create friction everywhere. The space-based communications, navigation, and imagery are essential. Both China and the United States have capabilities to degrade space support. And electronic warfare, jamming radars, disrupting communications, interfering with navigation, is central to modern operations, even when it is invisible in headlines. So how might a scenario unfold? A conflict would not begin with a formal declaration. It would begin with pressure, likely months of escalation that blurs the line between coercion and preparation. Gray zone pressure includes air incursions into Taiwan's ADIZ, naval exercises indistinguishable from pre-positioning, cyber probes, economic pressure, and information operations designed to undermine public confidence. These actions serve multiple purposes at once. They collect intelligence, test response patterns, normalize higher pressure, and shape the psychological environment. And for Taiwan, the dilemma is constant. Responding to everything is exhausting and expensive. Not responding signals that the pressure is acceptable. If the threshold is crossed into overt conflict, the opening phase is likely a joint firepower strike. Missiles targeting air defense sensors, runways, command nodes, and logistics. The goal is not total destruction. The goal is to degrade the defense system to a level where effective resistance becomes operationally difficult. And if that strike achieves enough suppression, the air and naval battle becomes the next determinant. Taiwan's surviving air force contests airspace. The PLA tries to establish air superiority. The outcome depends on survivability after the first strike, airborne early warning, electronic warfare, and the remaining ground-based air defense layer. At sea, in the strait itself, Chinese surface forces would push to establish control, suppress coastal missile batteries, clear mines, and neutralize Taiwan's navy. East of Taiwan, in the Philippine Sea, U.S. submarines would almost certainly be present, threatening Chinese forces and shaping how quickly reinforcements can arrive. Submarine warfare in that deep water environment could be one of the most consequential engagements in the entire scenario. If conditions are achieved, sufficient degradation of defenses, partial sea control, and force positioning, an amphibious assault becomes possible. But it is worth stating clearly, an amphibious assault on Taiwan would be among the largest forced entry operations attempted since World War II. Across open water, against a defender who has had decades to prepare. The number of troops and vehicles that can be delivered in the first wave is a binding constraint. Landing under fire is extraordinarily difficult. Taiwan's likely landing zones are not undefended beaches. They are prepared kill zones, obstacles, mines, artillery plans, and defensive positions in depth. Weather adds another constraint. The strait is shaped by seasonal wind and sea states, including monsoon conditions that can make amphibious operations extremely risky or impossible. If a beachhead is established, the conflict transitions into ground combat on Taiwan. Terrain becomes a defensive asset. The central mountain range divides the island and limits east-west movement, channeling operations. Urban terrain becomes its own problem. Cities like Taipei are dense, complex environments. Urban combat is costly and slow for any attacker, and catastrophic for civilians. And the longer the campaign runs, the more logistics becomes decisive. Sustaining a large ground force across 180 kilometers of contested water requires a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements. Every day, that bridge must survive interdiction efforts. From submarines, aircraft, missiles, and mines. The defender does not need to fight forever. It needs to fight long enough for the strategic environment to shift. And that brings us back to the global consequences. The U.S. decision, intervention or restraint, would be the most consequential military decision since Korea. Arguments for intervention include deterrence credibility across the Indo-Pacific, legal expectations under the Taiwan Relations Act, and the global economic stakes. Arguments for restraint include escalation risk, not including nuclear escalation and domestic political constraints. Japan is a critical allied variable. U.S. operations from Japanese territory require Japanese authorization. Decisions around base access would be among the most significant in Japan's post-war history. The Ryukyu Islands, close to Taiwan, have been reinforced in recent years with defensive systems that matter directly in a cross-strait scenario. Then there is the semiconductor economy. Taiwan produces roughly 90% of the most advanced semiconductor chips. TSMC's infrastructure is not easily replicated. Loss of that capacity would create a global shock touching defense electronics, consumer technology, automotive manufacturing, and more. The economic consequences extend beyond chips. The Taiwan Strait is one of the busiest trade corridors on Earth. Conflict disrupts shipping, reroutes global logistics, inflates costs, and creates cascading shortages. Financial markets would react immediately. And the long-term geopolitical consequences could be even larger than the immediate crisis. A successful seizure of Taiwan by force would represent a major revision to the post-war order, and would alter the strategic geography of the Western Pacific in ways that are hard to fully bound. Which is why the Taiwan scenario is not primarily a story about tactics. It is a story about systems. China's A2/AD, its naval expansion, its rocket forces, and its command reforms are all part of a system designed to solve one problem: raise the cost of intervention and shrink the window in which intervention can be effective. Taiwan's porcupine strategy is also a system. Make the operation unprofitable, even if it is technically possible. And U.S. strategic ambiguity is itself a system. Introduce uncertainty and preserve a tense stability without a formal commitment. These systems interact. They evolve. They constrain options. But understanding those constraints is the point. This is not about predicting outcomes. Structure does not determine outcomes mechanically, but it shapes possibilities, constrains choices, and sets the costs of every decision. That is always where the analysis begins. You have been watching the command structure. Subscribe if you think in systems.